Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're Daniel and Clara. We are doing this event, as you will know, as a part of celebrating 10 years of our collaboration. And throughout the month, we've been doing some online screenings of some of the work that we've done over the years, with introductions by people that we've worked with or friends, and invited them to reflect and introduce our work to others, as well as some online events. And today is the last event that we're doing as a part of this month. So we're very happy to just have this moment and have people join us to kind of, to look back on the journey that we've been on. And it's very nice to have Scott, who's our friend and an artist, filmmaker that we admire, to have a conversation with us about our work and especially about our latest feature film, Notes from a Journey. So this event is going to be a very informal conversation in many ways. We want people to join in. So I suggest maybe for the first bit, while Scott is asking questions and leading that, the microphones are turned off, but you can also come in and turn your microphone off and ask the question, and we can all just chat and try to let the conversation flow. Yeah, and I think that's it. Scott, you'd like to take on?
Yeah, so I'm Scott Barley. I'm a filmmaker as well. And yeah, I'm just really, really happy to have Daniel and Clara in conversation for this. They're good friends of mine, and we first met, I think, in Lisbon, after a couple of years of correspondence, and seeing their trajectory flourish almost a bit like a wild garden in a way over the past few years, in terms of like the diversity of what they've made, has been endlessly inspiring for me, and I think for many other filmmakers and artists. But as well as their diversity and their uniqueness, what has really sort of had an impression on me is their kindness, and their rare dedication and zeal to support other filmmakers. With Film Panic, the Moving Image Artist Salon, and things like that. And I've been a recipient of their kindness and their support on more than one occasion. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to talk with them and to get down to the nitty gritty with Notes from a Journey and some of their other projects.
Thank you.
So the first question I've got really is just, an obvious one, like how did you come to meet and work together?
Okay. So at this time, 10 years ago, I was living in Brighton and collaborating with some friends on a magazine called 1+1 Filmmakers Journal. And we were having a launch party for the latest issue, and Clara had written an article for this issue about Stan Brakhage. And we met at the launch party, at the launch event for this publication, and just started talking, and finding that we had a lot of ideas to exchange, a lot of things to say, and found each other quite interesting and inspiring. And at first it was just like a conversation that started, and when we left that day, it sort of seemed like there was going to be more to say, more to discuss. And the conversation continued, and very naturally and very quickly, within a couple of weeks, grew into our first film together, which was a feature film called Savage Witches, which we started on a couple of weeks later, but I think it took us, was it 18 months to make. And within this couple of weeks we started on this film. Within about a month, we had both given up our apartments and were staying with my sister, and we basically just wanted to dedicate every single moment of our time to making this film. And so we stopped renting apartments so we could afford to put any money that we had, which wasn't a lot, into the production. So I was sleeping on my sister's balcony, and Clara was on her landing, and Clara was sleeping in the cupboard under the stairs. And we lived like that for sort of several months in the first part of producing this film, just so we could completely immerse ourselves in this project. And it just has carried on since then. I think it's been very much like this obsession to spend every single moment making our work together on this kind of journey that started with a conversation that it feels like one conversation that has just gone on for 10 years, and the project just seems to spur into the next. And I don't know when we realized, but at a certain point we just knew that this was our life, that together we were going to dedicate ourselves to making art together, to just putting everything we had into this thing that it feels like a mission or a calling or something sort of along those lines.
Yes. I think it was the to also find another person that had that same ambition to kind of dedicate your life to a creative path, and that could really step up to that challenge, and realizing also that together we could do more than we could each alone, because I think neither of us really thought that we were going to be a collaborative artist in the way that we are, before we met, but somehow it just happened naturally. And it is really because of that understanding that a different kind of creative possibilities appeared and were available to us because of coming together, that weren't there if we didn't work together in the way that we do.
It sounds really intense. Really, you just like it, almost like two magnets, just coming together. There was that sort of like a immediately that kind of connection there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also just that maybe because also it was always centered in that creative exploration, and that helped it grow and shape itself always around the creative task that we had between the two of us.
My next question is, I've written this down, so bear with me because I'm looking at my computer behind my iPad. I've said I'm really interested in hearing from you both about the evolutions and revolutions of your praxis, but also how over time you've differentiated how you represent yourselves as artists. Because I remember when we were first in correspondence, you went under the banner, the Underground Film Studio, and then there was this clear decision to change from that and to go to Daniel and Clara. And I wondered, like, what was the reasoning behind those changes, and what do you feel has changed, from going from one name to another?
Yeah. So I think, we're always trying to push up against our own limitations and question everything about our behavior, about how we live, how we make work. The two, our life and our work is absolutely the one thing. It's the same. What we do in our work is also happening in us as well, in our inner lives. So there's always this kind of like dynamic between how we talk about the work, how we frame ourselves, how we talk about the labels, the language around the work, and what's happening in the work. And as the work seems to evolve, mutate and change, we find that we have to change our language around it, because language can restrict it in some ways, and it can also liberate it. If you change the name of something, it can kind of somehow free the thing. And I think we always, it's obviously something important to us to have the right words to talk about it, but we always feel frustrated by language. We always feel that we can't express ourselves as well with words as we can with images. When it comes to moving images, we feel very free, but when it comes to language and talking about it, we always want to be able to articulate it appropriately and honestly, but it always feels like a frustration. So I think that connects also to why we're constantly sort of revisiting how we describe the work, how we describe ourselves, and even how, you know, like, so some of the various changes that have happened is, originally we had this idea of the underground film studio, and this banner that we used for several years covers kind of quite a wide range of projects. And then at a certain point, I think it was 2018, we stopped the underground film studio, and also at that point decided to stop using our surnames. We simply became Daniel and Clara, and everything that we did was now just Daniel and Clara. We don't use our surnames anymore. We also wanted to stop using our nationalities and our genders, and we just wanted to simply be seen as one artist. And in that sense, it was to try and liberate ourselves from certain things that we felt restricted by. Like surnames carry a lot of baggage. They carry your family history. They have a lot of power to them, and so do all these other things that we use to sort of describe ourselves. So it's always this process of trying to be honest, trying to be find the appropriate language, the appropriate framing for the work, but also to try and liberate ourselves, trying to push us further, and and just go just that bit beyond where we are.
Yeah, and it really is about, it's in some ways it's the work that pushes that forward, and maybe that struggle with language is also because we feel like we have to be working around the wraps of the work, in a sense, to kind of be able to point rightly to it, and in a way to say we are Daniel and Clara now. It points to that artist, that, how we always say, the artist that exists between the two of us. It's not about me or about Daniel. It's about that combination. And I think, you know, when you think back about the underground film studio as well, it was also about trying to define or give the right platform to this thing that we were attempting to do right at the beginning, when our mission kind of first started. And then one of the things that was driving us was this feeling that we felt like we wanted to create cinema as artists, and we felt like we had a vision for what cinema could be as an art form. But it seemed like cinema was split into all these different categories, and we felt like we didn't quite fit into any of those. We wanted to kind of borrow from all of those, and we could see that something that was what we wanted to create, and there wasn't quite a word for it, or we felt like, actually, that's just cinema, and all the words are sort of like illusions, you know. And so I think the idea that for the underground film studio had come from this blend that we wanted to create, where of a studio that was both in the sense of an artist studio and a classic Hollywood studio, where the vision for the films was ambitious, was big, but there was also this daily work and craft that both an artist studio and the classic Hollywood studios had, which we really admire. But then really where we were coming from was maybe this tradition of the underground, of which was the artists creating film. And that's how we were seeing it, and the avant-garde, and it was trying to kind of bring those two together. And I think we went through a journey that was really about understanding how this vision sort of manifested in reality through the films, and how it manifested through us. And through all of that, we kind of realized we transformed into Daniel and Clara, who is who we are now. And those questions almost are not there anymore. They've been worked through and integrated into us, and it doesn't feel like we need to speak like that anymore.
Because, as an observer and a filmmaker myself, I think one of the commonalities that we have that you've just touched on is how there's been this sort of sense of essentialism and paring things back, removing the surnames, removing the kind of history. And, for me, it's, removing a lot of the things that you would tend to see, in a film, I suppose. An obvious narrative or actors, for example, and just it seems that you've been on this trajectory, and I would argue that, with the work that you had under the banner of the Underground Film Studio, there was quite a Baroque element. At times it was very dressed. There was a lot going on, and it feels that you have worked up through this period towards Notes from a Journey, where a lot of that excess has been removed, and it feels a lot more pared back. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I think what we were working through in some ways is the history of cinema, and somehow it's almost like we wanted to kind of make something in every vein of the entire history of cinema. Not that we even really attempted that, but I think we were just so hungry for all the possibilities of what cinema could be. Like we wanted it all somehow, and I think and we just felt like, even though people have been making movies for around 130 years, we still felt that there was just endless possibilities for what cinema could become. And one of our ways to kind of work through that and investigate that was to kind of draw upon make work directly in a dialogue with these various histories of cinema. And I think that much of that sort of period, the Underground Film Studio period, from the first film Savage Witches through probably to the Studio Diaries, is really just dealing with this idea of possibilities of how you make a film, what it could be in its various forms, and I think what you describe as sort of Baroque, which is the more theatrical kind of element, the use and really the absolute embrace of artifice, completely embracing sort of the fact that it's a performed piece. It's that that the image is kind of affected and mediated, that we were often using sort of quite strong colors, and pouring everything into these pieces. And I really think it was about us kind of just working through that history. And I think at a certain point with when we got to making the Studio Diaries, which if anyone hasn't seen the Studio Diaries, it's a period where we made 100 short films over 7 months. 7 months, yeah. And so these were made, like, each one was conceived, shot, edited, and then released within a single day. And
don't talk too much about this, because this is my next question.
So anyway, so I think with that project, with the Studio Diaries, we were kind of concluding this kind of period. And what happened in the Studio Diaries is we ended up in the films, and it kind of created a point when sort of our experiments with the possibilities of cinema and our personal lives kind of merged.
Yeah, in a way that it wasn't just about our inner images, because everything that was in the films, all the elements that existed in the films up until that moment, they were manifestations of imagination, and really us exploring in some sense our inner world. And we did a lot of research into and studied our dreams, and we studied in a way it was kind of like a symbolist period, or we studied alchemy and tarot, and we were really interested in just understanding the history of images and visual language that exists, that we feel it's the bare bones of cinema in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of just went all the way through, but this really happened also with looking at all the aspects that compose a film or filmmaking. So and rather than rejecting it, say, what can we do with this? How can, rather than rejecting, say, a script, say, how can we make a script interesting to us or work to us, or treat it in a different, what if a script is composed only of images, what does that do? If it's composed, exactly like a traditional Hollywood script, what does that do? And if we work with actors, what can we do with that? If we work with all of those things, we just had to experiment with that to see what we could do.
It's like we had to take cinema apart and work out what it was before we could then, as you say, strip it back and kind of work with something more essential.
And I think what happened then, it was just that suddenly it wasn't a question anymore. We just understood it.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of what you're talking about there, in a very pure way encapsulates Maya Deren's essay, in defense of the amateur. And she talks about how the amateur is actually, translates from Latin as lover, that you're the lover of cinema. And I think, your approach evinces that very clearly. And also you were talking about, this sort of, this history of images, and where they come from, and that makes me think of Jung's idea of the archetype, and also Nathaniel Dorsky's partner Jerome Hyler, who's a fantastic filmmaker in his own right, argues that cinema began with the stained glass windows of the Christian church, and the light coming in, and over the course of the day, through where the sun is coming in, the light that it created and the colors changed. So yeah, like, it's just wonderful to hear you both talk so passionately about that.
Our feeling is that cinema is really an impulse that is in the human being, that probably has been there since the absolute sort of dawn of humankind. And that this impulse towards making moving images is something fundamental in the human. In the same impulse of making still images, I think we have this impulse for making moving images, but it just took a lot longer for us to create the technology to create moving images. And it was really with, sort of mechanical kind of, sort of machines that could sort of show, like zoetropes and things like this, that it began to sort of materialize this sort of possibility of moving image. And then obviously when celluloid, when chemical photography was invented. But our feeling is always that actually there's something just in the human being that is about moving images. When we dream, these are moving images. So I think it must be something absolutely fundamental in human consciousness. So I think it probably goes back beyond stained glass windows, personally.
I agree. I just think it's a beautiful analogy that Jerome came up with. But I also think, you were talking, about the origins of cinema, and like, my perspective is it feels like there's almost like a circularity going on now, where the sort of the genesis of, what we consider cinema, with the Lumiere brothers, You know, previous to that, we had Muybridge with the Zoopraxiscope, and it was not so much about animating images to create cinema. It was more about a study of de-animating the moving image to really understand how it works. And I feel like what is really happening now with digital cinema, maybe even a bit earlier, you know, with certain filmmakers, like there's parts in David Lynch's Blue Velvet, for example, where he really slows down this sexual act between two characters and turns them into this kind of monstrum, this, you know, this animal. And, you know, since then we've had other filmmakers like Philippe Gondry dealing with that kind of thing, where they're actually studying the de-animation of the moving image. And I see elements of that in your, you know, more recent work as well. Which brings me on to my next question, really, where you were just sort of gung-ho with experimentation, and what I personally regard as an apex in productivity and creativity in any medium from the last, you know, the last few years, probably the last few decades, really. The Studio Diary series, and how you were conceiving and shooting and editing a short film pretty much every single day, 100 of them, and releasing them online the same day, which just, particularly with the way that I work, is insane. Like, I don't understand how like that is humanly possible. Maybe it isn't humanly possible. But yeah, just I want to hear how that, you know, what was the catalyst for that project, and, you know, what do you feel that you learned from it?
Well, I'll tell you what the catalyst was. So we were going through, so during these first few years, we were living in Espinho, which was a small town on the coast of Portugal, which was a sort of bit of a dilapidated house. So it was quite hard living conditions for quite a long time. And they also impacted the work that we were doing. But then at this time, in the beginning of 2018, we moved to a nicer place, a flat in Gaia that's just opposite from Porto. So we kind of gathered all of our stuff that in the previous house had been all stuck in one room, which was the one room that we could keep, you know, moist-free and warm, so all our equipment could be, you know, well preserved. And we moved into this nice new flat, and we started putting it all and arranging it, and we started rediscovering things we'd forgotten we had. One of them was a DV camera that we thought didn't work, but then we realized it was just missing the battery, and that we actually had a battery that was lying around that fitted the DV camera. So we turned it on and we started looking through it, and we just both immediately felt like, oh, this is like the cameras that we first started filming with when we were children. And it felt so magical to look through that camera, to hear the tape going when we recorded, that we just wanted to film with it all the time. And I think at the same time, we had started to think about the internet and films. The films that we had been doing were very much films for the cinema space, to be watched in a traditional setting. But the internet is kind of increasingly the way that people see films now and encounter work. So that was kind of going behind, you know, in the back burner of our minds, and the DV camera felt like such a sort of natural instrument to us, that we wanted to just explore with it to see what it could do. And the two things kind of came together, but almost in a unintended way.
And I think also because if anyone has shot with a mini DV camera, you'll know that you hold, so a DSLR camera, you have like this, they're this body with this lens on the front. A DV camera straps to the hand, and it's so amazing that it just feels like an extension of the body. And we really love that, the way different cameras affect your body in a different way. And so I think with the DV camera, it reminded us of these beginnings of when we both started making films, but we just love that sort of ease of use of the finger on the button. And because we've been shooting with a DSLR for a few years, which we really didn't like at all, there was something quite liberating about this sort of immediacy of that piece of equipment.
So yeah, I think it kind of just started as an experiment, and something that we just tried it out, but we found it so pleasurable that it's sort of we thought it needs to become something. I'm trying to remember how it was that we decided then to sort of create the Studio Diary series. I think
I think it's just this thing of like really trying to kind of erase the line between our work and our everyday lives, because we always, you know, when we're making a film, even if it's the films we were making previously where we used actors, it was always sort of deeply tied up with our own psychological journey, the things that were going on with us personally. And, you know, we've been going through this process of sort of getting rid of working with actors, sort of working with less and less crew. We started doing the music for our own films, the sound design ourselves. We'd already been doing all the camera work stuff. So it was really this process of just erasing things that weren't sort of this direct kind of relationship. And I think the diary film is a form. It's a narrative form. It's a thing that is sequential. It covers a period of time. And it was a way of kind of breaking down that barrier, I think. And in regards to the thing about the amounts, making so many so quickly, I think it's just, we had realized something about our creative metabolism. And I think all artists have a different creative metabolism. And we realized we have a very fast metabolism. Like we have an idea and we have to do it immediately, and it's like it calls to us, and in some ways if we don't get on with it immediately, we start to feel very sort of unhappy and it can cause, you know, sometimes we can even get sick if we're kind of ignoring ideas that are kind of calling to us. So I think it was very much like this thing that calls to us, and it becomes like a compulsion, and we have to do it in that moment.
Yeah, I think it's a way to also liberate ourselves from that pressure of, especially because we had been dealing so much with this and seeking so much this thing of like so much is possible with cinema still, and it's almost like all the possibilities were haunting us, and we had to create something where we could just work through that and maybe release that pressure. I think also at a certain point when we had created maybe around 20 of these, and we kind of thought, we don't know how we could carry on, but let's say let's going to make 100, because we have no idea how that will be possible. And somehow that becomes also in a weird way a liberating thing, because then you liberate yourself from what this has to be. It can just be what it is at that moment that you're doing it.
That was going to be, sorry, I was just going to say that was going to be my follow-up question. You know, how difficult was it to sustain that prolificity?
Well, I think actually, strangely enough, it wasn't difficult at all. It was very easy. It was just the right thing. Somehow we kind of created just the right parameters that we didn't feel necessarily a pressure. We just felt liberated, because anything within a certain sets that we set out at the beginning, anything was possible. So the rules that we had for it was that it would be shot with a DV camera. It would be shot within that single day. The sound would be recorded separately, and then we put it together in the editing phase. And in the same day, or in the same 24 hours, it would be released online. And we didn't plan any of them, but we would take the material of each day just as on whatever was happening. So we worked on other projects at the same time, and in a way, it was a year that was so full of so many things. And the studio diaries was, in a strange way, the way for us to deal with the pressure of all the other stuff that we were doing as well. It was our pleasure project. And it captured, and I think that freedom is captured in them, that sometimes we didn't know what we were going to film, and then we just turned the camera, but we would say, oh, we should do one, today. We turned the camera on and something interesting would happen just by looking through it. And it was also, as we kind of got more used to, I think we always wanted to kind of be in front of the camera as well, but we couldn't quite manage the shooting and being in front of the camera. And the studio diaries just very gradually helped us deal with that problem.
Amazing. So I guess I should start to talk about Notes from a Journey. And it's a very similar question to the last one, really. After finishing the Studio Diary series, was that the catalyst? Was the Studio Diaries the catalyst for Notes from a Journey? Because simultaneously, in some fundamental ways, it feels like a bit of a paradigm shift from what came before. But at the same time, it does feel totally connected to that diary-esque, journey, these sort of fragmentary parts that are then accumulated together.
So Notes from a Journey kind of was this film that we'd shot. We did a 2-week tour. We were still living in Portugal, and we did a 2-week tour around the UK where we were showing work at different venues.
This was in 2017.
2017, yeah. And while we were on that tour, we shot all this footage for a film, but we just had it sitting there on a hard drive, and every so often we would go to it, we would work on it a bit, but it was like this really problematic footage that we didn't quite know how all the pieces were fitting together. So we would kind of work on it for maybe a few days, a week, and then we would kind of go off and we would make another film, and then we would come back, and having made those other films, when we come back to it, it would sort of look different. We would sort of move it along just like a tiny bit, and then we would get stuck again. And I think it kind of went on like this for a while. And I think the Studio Diaries in some ways kind of helped unblock the whole thing, because we'd got so used to being able to kind of make decisions without letting the intellect get too much in the way. Because of the speed that the Studio Diaries were made, you couldn't overthink them, and it was incredibly liberating, and we learned so much that really the intellect can just trip you up and put barriers up in front of you, and it can be the enemy of the creativity in a way. And this is one of the reasons we like to create these kind of rigid frameworks, but then within that framework, we try not to be too intellectual. We try to just let it somehow flow instinctively. And because we're very analytical people, we can quite often corner ourselves. And I think what was happening with Notes from a Journey in its raw state was we just kept cornering, we kept questioning what it meant too much, what it was supposed to be. And I think actually through the process of doing the Studio Diaries, we managed to kind of open up that pathway into the part of the brain where things could just flow a bit more freely without us interfering. So I think maybe allowed ourselves to access a way of just having a process that would lead the way. And so I think that in that sense, that the footage already existed, but it was that process that kind of opened the door to enabling us to be able to put the whole thing together. So that it definitely is connected to the studio diaries in that way. Yeah.
Next one is like.
Did that answer the question? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My next question, like, it relates to several sequences within Notes from a Journey, where you have this very strong colour, often a primary colour, mainly obfuscating a landscape within the frame. And I was thinking, you know, personally, the filmmakers that I love, who have, you know, used the aberration, you know, in an aberrational way, the camera, opening up the aperture very wide, like Kijo Yoshida, to get incredible intensity of white coming in. And then I was thinking of my own work with, you know, particularly with Sleep Has a House being very underexposed, being the opposite. But this feels like something very different, you know, and really quite startling. And I was wondering, you know, where did this idea come from? And also, how do you regard it in terms of function? What is its function? Why these primary colours? And are they obfuscating, or did you have a different agenda?
The colour has always been a really important thing for us, and in a way that is very hard to articulate, because in some ways it's really about an aesthetic experience, and this in a sense that it's a physical experience as well as emotional and visceral somehow, and that it's about energy. And in our films up to this point, we explored color in lots of different ways, in thinking about it symbolically or you know, in different ways. But I think when we got to kind of Notes from a Journey, it was really about wanting to create an experience of color that was just color itself. And I think in some ways, actually, when we came to that solution, to those images of a color, we call them the color fields, the fields of color where you can just see a landscape behind it somehow. And when we watched that in the dark, the going through one color, then another, and then another, and somehow it was so intense, so kind of sort of made our eyes hurt. That was really interesting. It was kind of what we've been looking for.
I think it was the fact that, because when we first did it, the first thing we did was the red. That once we put the red on one of the images, it was the fact that suddenly the film was having this physical effect on us. And then after, you know, we'd watch the sequence and then we wouldn't be able to see. You'd look at you'd look around the room and everything would have this kind of glow in the middle of your eyes. And it just felt really interesting that it was creating this experience that was coming out of the screen, and you were becoming very aware of the mechanism of seeing, of how we were seeing, and how we were kind of experiencing the image, and we sort of just felt really excited by that, the possibilities of that. And we definitely, like, it felt like we were kind of going too far, and usually when we have that feeling that we're going too far, we kind of go with it. Like that's for us is a good sign. If we feel like, you know, is this too much? Is this gonna be unbearable for people? Then we kind of think, okay, can we do it more? Can we go even further? Like, because our fear is that we will just hold back, that we won't have pushed ourselves far enough. Like, we just think it's like a horrible feeling to kind of, you know, go to a cinema and your film's playing and you just think, I could have gone so much further. So we're always trying to push ourselves to some limit. And obviously we're always the first audience for this thing. So if we're feeling that it's extreme, and we know it, then we kind of feel like, okay, this is on the right track. I mean, there was no symbolism involved in the choice of colors. It was completely about how it was making us feel as we watched it. It was about the experience of it. We loved that it just made us conscious of how we were experiencing reality. And I think that was what just sent us on that journey of, you know, using very dark scenes, then a very red color field, then white, and how that would sort of like trigger off things, and how actually we were having different experiences of the same image as well, which is something we're really interested in, is how when you watch a film, every single person in the audience is seeing a slightly different film. They're bringing with to the film their own psychology, their own physicality. It's affected by what's going on in their body, what's happened to them in that day, also their personal associations with the kind of images and sounds that they're encountering. And we always want to make films that allow for all of those different experiences, and that hopefully can activate different experiences for different people, and can mean in the films that can mean different things to different people, without being completely vague and anything goes, but at the same time allowing the audience member to accept what they're feeling on their own terms, that whatever they're thinking or feeling is right. And the fact that we were creating this film together, and we were experiencing the red and the whites and these physical effects in slightly different ways, was kind of really exciting in that respect as well.
I think, you know, we both have a real deep passion and interest for that kind of corporeality in cinema, and how we can go beyond, you know, just vision and, you know, auditory elements of cinema, and how it can really become a cinema of the body. And the first time I saw the film was at the Slow Film Festival last year. And I, you know, when I think of slow cinema, you know, I'm not really that interested in the length of a take. And I didn't really regard Notes from a Journey as a conventional slow film. But what it does do, in the same way that I think is the inherent great thing about slow cinema, is that it makes you more aware of your own body, you know. And so a lot of people, you know, either from a positive aspect or as a criticism, often say, you know, cinema is boring and you're more aware of your body. You know, you've got an itch on your back and you scratch that itch, and, you know, you're more aware of how slow time is going. But if anything, that brings you more inside yourself and more aware of your own body, which I don't think predominantly the rest of cinema does. And so I'd just like to hear more about, you know, your interest in that sort of corporeal quality of cinema, and maybe what you think distinguishes cinema in that sense from the other mediums.
Okay, I'll actually be talking about painting first, because I kind of get this. I get this from cinema, but I almost understood it through painting. That we're living in a world now that is inundated with images, and the images are kind of the kind of images that surround us, you know, are sort of images that take away energy from us. They're sort of directing or giving information, but when you encounter great works of art, in some ways they are a source of energy, and you feel like something just expands. And and some works especially, that you kind of, the more you look at them, the more it kind of, this thing kind of expands. And in some ways, the encounter with the work of art, we think, needs to be this exchange of energy somehow. And that happens at that level of viscerality and corporeality that you're talking about. And I think cinema has a great potential for this, and a lot of films have it. I think even films that are completely unconscious of this power, in some ways they're not unconscious, because fundamentally cinema is about kind of giving you a jolt. We had been obsessed also with this idea of how can images be alive, have that energy, and how can we create images that when they come into you, you know, in the midst of this flux of images that just take, that they can give something and give space to the viewer to almost encounter oneself as you encounter these images. And I feel in painting, when you encounter great painting, that's what it's about. And cinema has different ways than painting to do this. But in some ways, because it is also very much a visual medium, that is one of the avenues towards it. But I think actually, when I think about our work and what produces that, one of the sort of most effective ways is sound. Sound is really the thing that kind of makes an image come to life. And we usually work on the images first and then work on the sound. And it's always an interesting moment that when you move from a kind of the edit into the sound edit, and the film starts shifting, and we almost kind of, everything that we felt was sort of working starts kind of not quite working. But it's just how certain things kind of come to the foreground that you didn't think about before, and that creates a different balance. And then in the way it's almost about, you have to go through the journey all over again of what the film needs to be. I think, does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
I think as well that, I can't remember exactly what you said, but I was reading an interview maybe at the start of this year with one of my absolute favourite filmmakers, Jean-Claude Rousseau, and he was talking about, you know, great paintings have presence. I think that's what you're talking about, you know, is presence. And I think, you know, lamentably, that's something that's missing from a lot of cinema, you know, the presence that painting has, you know, and I can only really think of a few filmmakers that really continue to always be able to produce this intense presence, you know, and there's no real, like you said earlier about symbolism, it's not necessarily symbolic of anything, it doesn't necessarily mean something, but you just feel it in your gut, you know, in a very, very visceral way. Before I open it up, I've got one final question, and it's a boring question, to be honest. But you know, when I watched Notes from a Journey, it was redolent at times of Derek Jarman's work, you know, obviously. But one of the things that really interested me was there was this kind of surreal horror kind of underpinning within it. And there was some leitmotifs within the film that just immediately made me think of my favorite work by David Lynch, you know, like Twin Peaks: The Return and Inland Empire. And I just wanted to hear, you know, not just in cinema, but outside of cinema, you know, who is influencing you? What is influencing you?
I mean, we're always looking at a lot of stuff. We're always looking at paint. We look at painting as much as we look at cinema equally. When we made Notes from a Journey, we really weren't looking at any films. It was very, we were thinking about people like Paul Nash, painters like Paul Nash, and these British landscape painters, and it was, I think it was really when we started to become more interested in that kind of tradition of British landscape art. So interestingly, it's sort of hard to see how Paul Nash feeds into it aesthetically, but somehow it was through going on a journey with his thing, and in a way maybe that surrealist connection that you're sort of referring to in the context of maybe Lynch and cinema, could connect to Nash, who was also dealing with, Nash's big thing was dealing with how can he be sort of a British artist in a traditional way and a modernist, you know, how can he was really struggling with balancing these sort of two things in the sort of 30s. And I think painting, like people like Nash and were definitely informing that film. But I think generally, over the last 2 years, we've really been thinking about where we belong in the context of British landscape art, which is mostly painting, but also sort of other things like literature and feeling that actually we do have a kind of connection to these things, and actually feeling for many years that our work didn't have a home. We didn't really know where we connected to, where we belonged. We didn't know where in the world we wanted to be based. You know, we were living in Portugal, but we never felt at home there. We were definitely living in our own little bubble. We've gone on this journey that's led us back to the UK and living now in the countryside in the UK, and feeling like we've kind of found some sense of home, in both in the sense of a tradition of art that we feel a connection to, and also feeling a connection to a place, and that art that we feel a connection to is about place as well. So I think there's that majorly going on in our work at the minute, and the artists that I'm sort of thinking about are Nash and people like Graham Sutherland. Who else?
It's sort of blank.
Yeah, I mean, at Virginia Woolf, we're like majorly interested in, you know, her interest in sort of consciousness and how you know, through language she depicts consciousness, and I think that really feeds into our thoughts about moving images. In terms of films, I mean, we just have watched so many films. I think for about 8 years we watched at least one film, a new film every day, sometimes 2, occasionally 4. We really absorbed a lot of cinema.
And there's people that we admire and we feel have had a great impact on us, but maybe in a way that can't quite be seen in our work. People like Marguerite Duras, Jacques Rivette, and Raul Ruiz, and then there's figures that you can't not be influenced by, like Godard, which maybe fed our intellect maybe a bit too much through the years. Yeah, but I think it's strange. It sort of feels like this new phase that we're in, it's less about consuming cinema and having to define ourselves in relation to that, but in a kind of wider history of image making, which we've always been interested in alongside cinema. But at the moment, it seems like that's mainly where we've been thinking about. I think in relation to someone like David Lynch, that is someone that we never used to, you know, think about at the beginning of our collaboration, say, but definitely like the last Twin Peaks was amazing and really exciting to see someone on a mainstream level doing something that we felt, yeah, this is where cinema really is at the moment. And we can see it in people, you know, such as you and other filmmakers working now that have that very immediate relationship with filmmaking that is only possible because of digital cinema and this new understanding of what the language of moving image is. But you know, he got that as well, and he's doing it on a level that obviously is much more visible And that's exciting, because I think when you see that something is happening, you know, on the margins as well as on the sort of level closer to consciousness, then you know that this thing is bigger. You know, I think for a long time we felt that we were just off on our own, alone, working through our obsessions, and then we kind of see there's so many others who are also, who have been going on their own journeys, but it's almost like we've been walking parallel to each other, and that's very exciting. And I think we are interested in consciousness, in creativity and unknowing to a certain extent, and Lynch's work, I think, is all about that too. So where there's connections is maybe because we're all kind of tapping into that same creative well of, you know, wonderfulness, which is slightly terrifying at times.
It's a deep well. It's a deep well. Yeah, I just like, sometimes I think about, you know, there could be some old couple, you know, back in 2017, who just, you know, had finished their dinner and they were sat down and they were like, oh, should we see what's on the TV? And they turn on Showtime and they see like episode 8 of Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
It's just like, what must they have experienced? They've had absolutely no prior, you know, knowledge or understanding of that kind of cinema. You know, just I envy those people.
Yeah.
You know, but it was, yeah, incredible. So yeah, I'm happy if you guys are to open it up to anybody who's got any questions.
Yeah.
Just make sure that your mic is not turned off if you've got any questions, and also you can write them in.
I got a question, if I can ask.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi. I wrote this down. So you're like for Daniel and Clara, your like work is like in a dark house at night, and it's like late, like it kind of moves in and out. I'm talking about Notes from a Journey, where it's like it moves in and out of the house and stuff. And like for Scott, the house in Sleep Hazard House, it's only like kind of alluded to. Is this like so like the presence of the house is like a continuous question? Do you ever feel like this as a resource is kind of like exhaustible, like within like cinema and stuff? Like, does that make any sense?
So you're talking about the idea of the house as a sort of a reoccurring symbol? Is that what you mean?
Well, not so much as a symbol. Like, I guess the presence of the house is kind of constantly in question. Just because there's like no physical house, or I guess I think a lot about houses because of like Tarkovsky's Sacrifice and stuff. But like there was an actual house there that like, was burnt eventually. But this is just like the house is just being alluded to constantly and stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, with your guys's, with like Daniel and Clara, we see the house, but in Scott's, the house is only like alluded to and stuff.
Mm. Well, I think in Notes from a Journey, they're Airbnbs, so it's the places we're staying as we travel. But saying that, the house and the idea of a cottage or a house in a woods reoccurs throughout our work, from our earliest work. And you know, in our early work, which is more sort of dealing with mythology and fairy tales, the house is there. And I think it's I guess it's the idea of the home is quite powerful. It's something that we all have some kind of archetypal image that lives within us of home, of shelter. And I think it maybe even connects to the idea of the body. It's in a way, the house is like an extension of the body. And I think in our work, I mean, I don't know how this fits for Scots, because I mean, it's quite interesting, because as you're saying, it's Scots, you don't see a house, but it's alluded to in the title. But for us, I think the house is often connected to some kind of psychological center. And I think with Notes from a Journey, we were the process of making that film is looking for where we felt a sense of home, a psychological center that meant something. And actually, we found that psychological center in Avebury, in the prehistoric mound. Kind of came to be this sort of external symbol for us of some sort of center. And it was through making that film that we decided to move back to the UK and realized that we felt some very personal sort of spiritual connection to the landscape here and to the place here. So I think that's all tied up with that, really.
Yeah, I would say, or maybe offer that interpretation of a house as something that is about that an intimate space, in a way, a kind of close or personal psychological space, if it's not an actual house. And I think you could say that about Tarkovsky's Sacrifice, that house is the container for this experience that is an intimate experience of a person and their family through the end of everything. Maybe.
As for me, what really interests me about the idea of the house is how precarious it is. Like when you think larger than the bricks and mortar that we sort of separate ourselves from the outside world in. What is our house? What is home? And we think of home as being shelter, as something familial, something protective. But what if the house was to turn on you and actually work against you in some way? And I think it's very similar to a house of cards. The house of cards, you stack them, but it is very precarious. It can all topple and come down.
Well, the house we lived in Portugal, the beach house that we lived in for 5 years, I think. Yeah, I mean, that was falling down around us, and it was on the beach. So we had the sea was just like, the sea air was just plummeting against the house the whole time. Everything in the house was damp. It was like the outside was invading. I mean, sometimes we'd be sitting in one room and we'd hear this crash in the other room and go through, and the plaster will have all fallen off of the ceiling because the house was just so dilapidated. So we've experienced that kind of house on the edge of sort of disintegrating.
And also the invasion of the elements, and that it's also vulnerable, really, everything that we try to construct, especially with something like the sea air. And the coast of Portugal gets very misty, even in summer. So that dampness can just penetrate everything. There's no barriers for mist, which is wonderful, but also difficult to live with. We used to have to replace the lock of the front door every year because it would get so rusty and it would break.
That sort of just completely reveals the folly that, since, I talked about this with Niles yesterday, who I think is here, since the dawn of civilization, there has been this sort of ongoing process, this trajectory of humankind trying to supersede nature itself, and in the process forgetting that to supersede nature is to suicide ourselves. That there is absolutely no distinction, and all these bricks and mortar is just folly. If nature wants to take it back, it will. And the other thing I think of house is maybe totally unrelated, I think it's so strange and fascinating that, say you have a dream and you know in your mind that it's your house, but if you look at the images you see in your dream, it's never your house, but you know that it's your house. And there's always, you know, stairs going somewhere else and rooms that don't exist in your house, but something is telling you that it's yours, that it is your house. And I really like that kind of that tension. Again, it is just that precariousness, you know, reality and the unknowable. Is there any more questions?
I have a question. I want to ask you about the relation between landscape and the body, because in your last film, En Plein Air, there's a strong connection between the contemplation on landscape that can cause, for example, body paralysis in some moments. And then in Not for a Journey, you made some sort of investigation about atmospheric weather and landscape. So my question is, what is the relation between a body, or your own body, and the landscape, and that kind of mixture between them? Is there a, you know, some sort of mixing the body with the landscape, and there is no beginning of ending of on each other?
I think one of the things that we've thought about a lot, not necessarily just now in making those films, but before, you know, while we were living in this house in the mist, is where is the, where can we say is the limit between who we are and where we stop and something else begins, and that nature, often nature is thought of as this other thing that is, you know, out there outside of the door, but really it's crazy to think like that. We are nature as well. Nature is happening within us all the time, and you know, everybody has felt how the body also has agency over themselves, things we don't want to deal with, but the body just kind of takes over and imposes its will on you. So I think really for a long time we've been thinking of the body as and nature as an extension of each other. We have two words for it, but we could also maybe just have one. And I think, but so when we kind of started looking more towards making work about landscape, for us it was also about being in a place and responding to that place, how the place kind of activates things in us, and also how we project our inner world or inner psyche onto that place, and in turn affect it too. And so it's that really seeing that separation as a kind of permeable place where one affects the other that has led to a work like En Plein Air. That's really was so almost zooming in on that experience of how the elements outside are affecting us, or could be seen as like what's happening in the body is an extension of what's happening outside.
That's very much the feeling I got. It was as if like the outside world was having some very deep-rooted effect on your character's internal plight, if you like, in a very physical way. We've had a question in the chat. I'm probably going to mutilate the pronunciation of your name. Is it Hania or Jania? They ask, my connection is really bad, so I can't ask this in person, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current state of cinema in that way, which you said Twin Peaks: The Return embodied on primetime TV. You guys have obviously been doing this for long, so what do you feel is the shift? And their second question is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on mainstream media apps like TikTok to be really extreme, or YouTube pop-ups, YouTube pop-ups in their heyday. From what I've seen of your work, you two enjoy, outside of simplicity, heavy distortion that may be unrecognizable, but also people have that relation to filters and video processing nowadays that was definitely missing in the past. Is there any potential for a new relation with video art and a larger new appeal of art cinema to a wider audience?
Okay.
It's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. So the first question is about,
how do you feel about the shift that's happening in the current state of cinema?
I think what they're touching on there is like how we could say over the last maybe 15 years, there's been this sort of confluence of cinema and television. And now, you know, particularly in, say, the last 4 or 5 years, really interesting things are happening.
I think it's, you know, like what it takes time for, you know, technology changes, and then it takes time for artists to kind of work out what to do with it. You know, there's always people who kind of at the very beginning are into new technology and kind of respond and do something interesting. But it's, I mean, for us, we've only just set up an Instagram this year. We were given an old iPhone, so it's the first time not only that we've had an iPhone, but a phone in many years. When it comes to technology, I mean, we're really behind everybody else. But for us, it's like when things, when there is technology there, all technology has limitations and it has potentials. And I think artists will just be able to work with that. And I think that at any point in history, the technology has had potentials and limitations, and artists have kicked up against those limitations and tried to expand the possibilities and found new ways to kind of think about it. So I think, I mean, I don't really know what TikTok is. I've heard about it, but YouTube pop-ups in their heyday. I mean, I think artists will always respond to what's available and use it to make art. I just think that's just how it always has been and always will be. And there's particular kind of dressing of the time, but art is this, and creativity is this eternal thing that's always happening, and it will just fill the tools, the technology, and the forms of the time, and use those kind of limitations and possibilities. So, I mean, I think it is, what's exciting about this moment is that anybody can make a film. It's been like that for more than 10 years, that anybody who can have access to some kind of recording device can make some kind of motion picture. And now, you know, it's the presentation of those online, the quality of that has improved. So that kind of means that maybe the breakdown between sort of mainstream, the way mainstream images look and homemade images look, there's not really any difference anymore. I mean, you know, we can shoot in 4K and, you know, create sort of high quality sound mixers and do all of the things that TV can do, that mainstream cinema can do to a certain point. The tools can be the same if we want them to be. So I think, you know, there's something interesting that happens there. It stops being, as artists, we have to think, there is the mainstream, we are here, we're in opposition. It's just, you have to think about it differently. That old dynamic of the underground and the mainstream, I think is sort of maybe become less relevant. And it really comes back to the artist to think, what kind of images do I want to make? How can I make meaningful images for me and for following your own path? And I think that's probably the great liberation of this time that we're living through from our point of view.
Yeah, and I think also that it's one of the things that takes, actually, I think that takes longer than just simply the kind of adapting to a new technology. What really takes longer is your perception of what your limitations and your goals are. Because, and I think we've been through a period in our working time where we've seen that very clearly, that there were certain creative possibilities already there 10 years ago, but it was almost like people couldn't see them or accept them because they didn't fit the paradigms of what they thought art or cinema or video art and all those different things, what those things were. And like you were saying, the means, for example, for showing films online have improved quality in a sense, definitely since like 10 years ago. And you know, and if we go back 15 years, there wasn't feature films on YouTube 15 years ago. So there was even a lot of the history of cinema that wasn't available to to a very few people up until very recently. So the fact that we can mention someone like Stan Brakhage now, and almost everybody has seen something, that didn't happen until very recently. So there's really a kind of a psychological thing that has to happen, where it's your expansion of what you think is possible, and what is possible now is that that old dynamic of the counter culture and the mainstream. It just isn't possible anymore. There's been a kind of explosion of how that is negotiated, and I think that's great, because it means now we can treat what we're receiving, the images that we're receiving, by themselves, without and I think for artists then this means also that we can really think about the contexts in which we decide to show the work in are a part of the meaning of the work, and that shouldn't be forgotten. Certain kinds of works are experiences that have to be seen in certain ways, and for example, durational cinema needs an infrastructure that is different to a kind of moving image that can go on Instagram or on YouTube. That is part of its meaning as well. It's part of its experience. And maybe I think that's something that we all really need to be thinking more about, is where we're putting the work is a part of the meaning. And I think also, I don't know how really most people experience TV now, because I think something like Twin Peaks, I wonder really if most people that have seen it haven't really seen it in that TV, they've seen it on their laptops or computers, or waited to have the whole series and then watch it through, or watch it, one episode per week, or all of that somehow has now gone to the viewer. The viewer has a lot more possibilities of how they watch things, and it's beyond, in some ways, the filmmaker's ability to control too.
Yeah, there's definitely been a huge increase in, the autonomy of both the creator and the consumer, I think, and that's had like a huge, a huge effect. And also how novelty has become normalcy in some sense. Like, I remember even just a couple of years ago, when I finished Sleep Has a House, a lot of what was written about it was focused on the fact that it was shot on an iPhone. And really, the only reason I made the film on the iPhone was because it was the camera that was always in my pocket. It was a sensible decision, because it was the camera I always had on me. Yeah. It wasn't some kind of headline grabbing act. And I remember at the same time, while making the film and finishing it, that a lot of the articles about films that had been shot in an iPhone were nothing but that. They were almost always mediocre or very poor films, which were really banking on the otherness, if you like, of shooting on a mobile phone. And I think, thankfully, that period now seems to have ameliorated, or is in the process of ameliorating. And we're now going to get to a stage where we really focus on what is actually possible with anybody being able to make a film if they really wanted to, and not on the novelty of it, but actually the democracy of it.
I think, you know, we're already seeing in the last few years so many more really interesting films made at all levels, really, from artists to big mainstream to small budget to big budget, because there was also a time when mainstream film lost completely its edge and its interest, and there was no imagination, nothing going on. I think there was, but I think now it's almost everything has kind of been reinvigorated somehow, and you see also people accepting formal experimentation a lot more, and even the concept of feature-length artist film isn't, you know, completely extreme anymore. There's a lot more, and I think, you know, that's exciting. It's great. It just takes time.
Yeah. How much longer are you guys happy to go on if there is any more questions?
Yeah, if there's one or two more questions, then we can do those.
I've got a question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Just going back to the point you said earlier about your kind of higher artistic metabolism and just kind of producing so much film in a short amount of time. And I was just wondering, you know, going through all these different permutations of cinema and each film is different to the other, are you hoping to find like some kind of zenith point in your practice? Or get to a model of cinema that you've made which somehow supersedes what you've made before? Or is it just kind of making films for the sake of making films, if that makes sense?
I think, you know, we're really just following our creativity. I mean, the way we see how we work is really that we're in service to the creative spirit, and we're not completely in control. So we had that period where we were making a lot of work, and we were thinking a lot about the history of cinema, and I don't think that we were necessarily seeking, you know, some kind of end point with it. I think we were just absolutely excited and invigorated by the creative possibilities. In a way, I don't know how much we've really slowed down, because I think we still have that same creative metabolism, but I think we've kind of narrowed our focus a little bit over the last couple of years. I mean, we've kind of limited ourselves in some ways, and maybe even focused our energy. There's certain things like the fact that we're not working with lots of performers. It's mostly just us now and the camera, the landscape. We're in the film and we're behind the scenes. It's kind of it's stripped down in many ways, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that's like an end point where we'll stay. I think it's where we've arrived at for the moment, and it seems like we're going to be here for a while. We have a few projects planned in a similar vein to Notes from a Journey and Un Plein Air and sort of the other things we're doing around that. But I mean, it's just, who knows where creativity will take us. We could guess, but then we've predicted before where we're going to go, and then suddenly we find ourselves doing the exact thing that we said we wouldn't do, and you know, we're more interested in following that creative thing than sticking to any personal decisions, or, you know, anything the intellect has decided will be thrown out in favor of the creative process
and that impulse. And I think that it certainly feels, from a personal perspective, that with each project we have we go through a transformation, and it never feels like we're kind of going back. It feels like we're moving forward as we're moving forward through our lives, and certain questions that maybe were essential at one point are kind of done now, and we move on to others. But I don't know if we could say that these are more advanced questions or not. I don't think that art works that way. What matters is that moment of creativity and that energy. And in some sense, that goes back to the dawn of time. The first artworks have that same energy, and that it can't be improved. Art doesn't improve. It's always just about going to that point. And it's like all the artists throughout time are all kind of reaching back and touching a center. That's what it is.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I'm stealing that. That's great. Are there any more questions?
Yes, I would like to ask Daniel and Clara, can we expect to see the plot points next year?
It's on a journey.
So we have this film that we shot in 2018
with Bradley, who is here.
Yeah, so we shot this feature film in 2018. It's all completely shot. It was all filmed in this. It was like the last kind of week that we were in this seaside town where we were living, and we shot this film over a couple of days. And it's all about the sea and the mist and the psychological condition of that space. But we've been going through this journey with it, where similar to Notes from a Journey, where we will edit for a couple of days and then we just reach a point where we have to put it away again. And I really, who knows when it will be finished. I mean, it kind of comes and then it goes and then it comes back and it's changed a little bit and then it goes. I mean, we always have projects that have different rhythms and time spans. We have like these projects that kind of like plot points that they go over this long period, and then we have these little ones that just burst up and they happen really quickly. They're, shot, edited and released in no time. And this seems to be one that was shot very quickly but just is drifting in and out now and again. So sorry, Nicola, I can't
we can't say where
Okay.
yeah. But it's interesting that each project has its own momentum as well and its own time. And it's like we kind of used to talk about it when we were growing our own veg, that it was just like gardening. Some things you have to pay attention to all the time or they burst out very quickly. Other things just stay there and you only tend to them every once in a while. And if you do too much, then you end up harming it. I think plot points is one of those.
Thank you.
These analogies are great. Any more questions?
Yeah, I would have another question if that's all right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So I was wondering whether you could potentially talk about some of the filmmakers that initially really set you off in a way on your journey of exploring cinema for you. So the initial works that really gave you that inexhaustible stimulus in a way, because what I found interesting about that is that oftentimes you will go back, and even if a particular work doesn't really resonate with you anymore, you can kind of see the seeds that were there in the beginning, you know what I mean, that kind of still have their traces, so to say. I was wondering about that. Yeah.
But I think for me it was as a child watching Derek Jarman, and just being I was as a child I wanted to be a painter. I was convinced that I would spend my life painting, and my uncle introduced me to the films of Derek Jarman, and literally within the space of watching his film The Garden, between watching it the beginning and the end, I realized that cinema could be as immediate and personal and expressive as painting, and I was just totally hooked. And that definitely like started the whole thing for me. Yeah, and actually, and then it's a good friend of ours, a producer called James Mackay, who produced the film The Garden, was one of our first supporters, and we've worked with him quite a lot over the years, and worked quite closely with him, helping with the Derek Jarman archive. So we got to sort of look at, we helped with the Super 8 archive, and we got to see everything that he shot. And so I think Derek Jarman has definitely been a really sort of key influence, and then being able to kind of get close to that work and really spend time with it, I think had a massive impact.
I think for me, for example, the work of Fassbinder was one that kind of revolutionized my idea of cinema, and feeling kind of sort of activated it all for me, feeling kind of uncomfortable and fascinated at the same time, and the way that it's both controlled and rough, and just his genius. He's a genius. All his films are just masterpieces, and his total devotion to his work, I think, was for me very inspiring too.
He also had a high metabolism.
Yeah. I think at the time when we started working together, one of the sort of big inspirations, almost like the energetic spark that we responded to, was Vera Chytilova, in particular her film Daisies and Fruits of Paradise, and that somehow had the kind of some narrative and formal expression and possibilities that were what we were looking for as well. And
I actually remember the first time that we met at Dr. Boa. There was the Chytilova retrospective.
That's right,
yeah, which was amazing. Yeah, absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and so many of her films that we hadn't, like even at Dr. Boa, they were saying so many of those films hadn't been seen since she had made them. And people now, that Daisies and Fruits of Paradise are fairly well known, but then they were completely hidden or lost. But things have a way of turning back up.
Any more questions? No.
Oh wait, mine isn't the question. Mine is to say hi. Like, I haven't actually seen you in 5 years, so like to see your faces, your voices is incredibly delightful.
Oh, thank you so much. So nice to see you. It's so nice to see everybody. It's wonderful. Yeah.
I got to say, David is an amazing filmmaker as well, and everyone should watch his films because there's nothing like them. You've never seen a film like David Finkelstein's films.
No, absolutely. David, are your films available on VOD or anything for people?
Yeah, they're on my Vimeo page.
Cool. We'll share it again. And
no, actually, no. Now that I think about it, I did have a comment to make. This is just something that came up when you were talking about how you move through the process in the studio diaries and going into Notes from a Journey. What I was getting from that, which relates to how I work also, is the idea of, after a while, gradually giving yourself permission to know that in the creative process, that you don't have to know what you're doing in order to work. You can work without knowing what you're doing. You could just look at footage and say, oh, this needs to be shorter or longer or lit differently, without having to know what you're doing.
Yeah. I think one thing that happened as well is the confidence in the craft and not having to think about the technological things and the craft. And once we've, like making the studio diaries, once you've done 100 films in that, we just felt like we could just do it. So that really helped, I think. So we didn't have to think about how do you make a film, how is this going to fit together? We just sort of were able to trust. And yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right. And it's we always have an element of frustration in every single film we make, as frustration seems to be tied up with our creative process. But we trust a lot more now. Even when we're frustrated, we kind of know that it will be okay. Whereas we used to get really bogged down with that frustration and those obstacles.
And in some ways that made it take longer as well. Because we have to fix it, you know, and then you spend a lot of time trying to fix until you realize actually you have to just go back and trust that thing, go back to that first thing.
I think as well, that's one of the hardest things to sort of really live with, is that creativity chooses you. It's not the other way around, you know, for the most part, and that it's simultaneously outside of you and inside you, inherent in some way. And you know, I think we've both talked about how a lot of the time we just feel like conduits, you know, we're just you know, channeling some kind of form that runs through us, and all we're doing is giving our own perspective to it, you know. We can't really deviate from what it's destined to do, in a way, you know. It sounds hackneyed, but I think it is a bit like that.
I agree. The way we see it is that there's this kind of undifferentiated creative energy, and that we are a condition that it kind of speaks through. So that same energy might speak through you, and you're a different condition, and it will manifest differently through the conditions of your particular psychology, you know, your age, the time that you're living in, your culture, your family history. All of these things create the sort of particulars of your work. But this thing is somehow sort of this eternal creative energy, and it will just keep coming through different people. And you know, everyone here who's creative, it will be coming through into your work differently because of your particular conditions. But in some ways it's the same energy that's just needing to come into being somehow, and that's really how we see it, and how we see ourselves in service of that thing. And I think actually by being two people working as one artist, it's really helped us kind of understand that and be able to kind of surrender to that. Because we're two, we can kind of understand where our own psychology is and where there's this other thing coming through. And the way that we work is we both put everything, any idea that comes to either of us, we both put it on the table, and then it belongs to us both equally. And we don't have any preciousness over it. If, you know, if it doesn't work, it goes. If it works, it stays. Or if, you know, if it excites us, we both have to be equally excited by the thing. If for some reason one of us thinks something isn't quite right and the other one thinks it's good, rather than argue it out, what we do is we look for another possibility. We always think there's more possibilities available, because really it's this creative thing that's speaking through us is absolutely unlimited. We're limited. Human beings, you know, our consciousness is limited. But knowing this thing is unlimited means that we can just seek to find sort of a wider possibility, and it just keeps us open and receptive and realizing that there's more ways.
It's great. If there's no more questions, I'm happy, you know, for us to call it, if you like.
Okay, well,
yeah,
thank you everyone for joining us, and allowing us to talk about our work and our ideas. It's been really an interesting month for us, for looking back and thinking about
where we've been,
what we've done over the last 10 years, and thinking about where we're going next. And it's nice to have these opportunities to reflect. So thank you everyone for being here.
And thank you for all your questions.
And thank you, Scott, for your questions and friendship, and thank you so much.
I just want to say, you know, thank you so much for asking me, and I feel emotional, like seeing you, you know, and other people, you know, that I love very much, and you know, not being able to, you know, cross paths in a
Yeah.
corporeal way right now.
Mm.
And just a huge congratulations to you both, you know, on 10 years of, you know, incredible productivity and creativity.
Thank you.
And, you know, just hope it continues, and that next year things will be a bit safer for us all.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything comes and goes.
On a final note, I also
wish it's odd sometimes to do this, but at the same time it's great, you know, because we can see each other and we can, you know, and see people like David that we haven't seen in years, but this is an opportunity we actually see each other.
Absolutely.
So, you know,
I think there was maybe someone was going to say something.
Yeah, exactly. No, I also just really wanted to thank the three of you for hosting this event, because I just also want to communicate to you that the work of the three of you has been and still is just such a tremendous inspiration for me, and it's just unbelievably wonderful to be able, or to have gotten the chance to talk to you. So really, I'm
Thank you so much.
looking forward to hopefully the next times.
Thank you.
Thank you.